Mark Levin leaned forward, his voice sharpened to a taunt, dripping with the kind of sarcasm that seeks not to debate but to belittle. "Oh, Jasmine Crockett," he scoffed, drawing out her name like a schoolyard bully tasting the syllables. "Remind us again, where did you get that law degree? Was it a cereal box? A 2-for-1 coupon special?" His words landed like darts, meant not just for her but for everyone watching, an attempt to paint her as unworthy, unserious, illegitimate. The audience shifted uneasily. Some laughed on cue, others smirked, but many felt the sting behind the insult. In that moment, the air thickened, carrying the weight of history. Generations of women, of immigrants, of people of color whose credentials were always questioned, whose very presence was always mocked. Levin's sneer was more than an insult to one person. It was a performance of dismissal aimed at all who dared to rise from outside the privileged circle. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it stretch, a pause so sharp it sliced through Levin's theatrics. Her eyes locked on him with unshaken resolve, and for a heartbeat, it was as if the room itself was holding its breath. The crowd expected anger, defensiveness, or a flurry of words, but Crockett's stillness carried a different power, the kind of power that makes an opponent realize they've overplayed their hand. And then, like a drumbeat underscoring the drama, the narrator's voice rose above the tension. In that moment, everyone thought she would shrink. Instead, she rose. What Levin thought would be a punchline was about to boomerang back, harder than he could imagine. The silence wasn't surrender, it was the storm gathering. The air crackled with anticipation, and somewhere deep inside, even Levin seemed to sense it. The mockery that began as a smirk would not end as a victory. The audience leaned in, eyes darting between the sneering pundit and the calm figure across from him. They didn't yet know what Crockett would say, but something in her composure told them this wasn't going to be another exchange lost in the noise of politics. This was going to be different. And just as Levin prepared to press his advantage, Crockett opened her mouth. What came next would leave the entire room in disbelief. The words were still hanging in the air, Levin smirking as if he had landed the final blow. But what made this moment dangerous for him was not just what he had said, it was what it represented. To dismiss a black woman's hard-earned law degree on national airwaves was not just a jab. It was a declaration, a reinforcement of a long, ugly tradition. It was the old message wrapped in a modern sneer. You don't belong here, no matter what you've achieved. That's why the stakes were higher than a televised spat. This wasn't simply about ego or two personalities colliding. It was about who gets to be seen as legitimate in America, who gets to be respected, to be recognized as a professional, as a leader, as someone worthy of the same deference handed out without question to others. Levin's mockery tapped into a raw nerve, one that ran through courtrooms, boardrooms, and classrooms across the country. Every immigrant who'd ever been told their degree did count here. Every woman whose authority was undermined by a smirk. Every young person from a working-class family who had fought to earn their place, only to be treated as an imposter. They could see themselves in Jasmine Crockett at that moment, and they could see Levin as the embodiment of the gatekeepers who tried to slam doors shut. The tension in the room wasn't about one insult, it was about what would follow. Would Crockett allow the narrative to stand? Would she let his derision echo unchallenged, validating the idea that credentials, when held by people like her, were somehow lesser? Or would she find a way to transform his condescension into a turning point? The truth was, Levin had raised the stakes without even realizing it. He thought he was scoring an easy point, a moment of ridicule to energize his followers. But he was laying the groundwork for a reversal so sharp it would cut deeper than any insult could. He was setting up the very stage on which Crockett would flip the script, not just for herself, but for everyone who knew the sting of being underestimated. And that's what made the air feel charged. Because the insult wasn't trivial, it was symbolic. It was America's larger conflict condensed into a single exchange. The arrogance of those who mock versus the resilience of those who rise. The crowd may not have known it yet, but they were about to witness not just a clapback, but a cultural statement. The narrator's voice lingered over the tension. What happens when arrogance underestimates dignity? What happens when the loudest voice in the room suddenly meets the one person who refuses to shrink? The answer was coming. And when it arrived, it would not only silence the room, but ripple outward, forcing the nation itself to pay attention. Because Crockett wasn't about to just defend her law degree. She was about to turn Levin's insult into a mirror, reflecting back the fragility behind his arrogance. She was about to remind the country that credentials are not given value by those who mock them. They are given value by the sweat, sacrifice, and resilience it takes to earn them. The stage was set, the stakes were clear, and every second of silence was a countdown. Levin thought he had cornered her. Instead, he had opened the door to a reckoning he would not see coming. And as Crockett leaned forward, ready to speak, the audience braced themselves. Because what came next would not just change the temperature in the room, it would change the conversation far beyond it. To understand the weight of this confrontation, you have to understand the man who launched the attack. Mark Levin is not just another voice in the crowded landscape of political commentary. He is a figure sharpened by decades of combat in the conservative movement, a radio titan turned television firebrand, known less for reasoned debate than for thunderous pronouncements delivered like verdicts. For his fans, Levin is a warrior. For his critics, he is a bulldog with a bark so relentless it drowns out nuance. His rise was built on a strategy: overwhelm, ridicule, belittle. From the early days of his career, Levin mastered the art of confrontation not by engaging in dialogue, but by burying opponents under waves of sarcasm and scorn. If others sought to persuade, Levin sought to dominate. His voice, gravelly and charged, became a weapon that, over time, earned him loyal followers who mistook volume for victory. This style of attack had worked for years. Politicians, journalists, and academics who stepped into his crosshairs often stumbled, caught between defending themselves and trying to match his fury. Many left those encounters diminished, their reputations bruised by the performance of Levin's ridicule. And that was the point. Humiliation was his currency. To mock Jasmine Crockett's law degree was not a new tactic. It was his old playbook, sharpened by repetition, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already assured. But beneath the bluster, there was something else, a pattern of underestimation. Levin's worldview thrived on the idea that certain voices, especially women of color in positions of power, were inherently less credible. It was an assumption wrapped in arrogance, but also in fragility, the fear that their very presence threatened to dismantle the hierarchies he had long defended. To mock Crockett was to reaffirm to his base that the traditional order still stood, that credentials from someone like her were laughable rather than laudable. And yet, Levin's strength was also his greatest weakness. His reliance on mockery, his dependence on volume over substance, left him exposed when he encountered opponents who didn't play by his script. He thrived when his adversaries reacted emotionally, when they scrambled to defend themselves on his terms. But when met with silence, composure, and strategic precision, his power faltered. His bombast was a show built on momentum. Once interrupted, it could unravel. This moment with Jasmine Crockett was different because she didn't meet his mockery with the frantic defensiveness he expected. Instead, she wielded silence like a weapon sharper than any insult. In that silence, Levin's own words echoed back at him, sounding less like triumph and more like desperation. The audience began to see it too. The sneer that once looked powerful now seemed petty. The smirk that once commanded attention now revealed insecurity. For years, Levin had cultivated the image of the untouchable voice of authority, the man who could not be rattled, the master of every exchange. But here, in this room, with cameras rolling and eyes fixed on every twitch of expression, the cracks in that image were beginning to show. The arrogance that had carried him so far was about to collide with something he had not anticipated. A woman who had endured bigger battles, who had faced down real obstacles, and who would not give him the satisfaction of a predictable collapse. And that was the irony. In trying to diminish her, Levin had elevated the stakes. In mocking her law degree, he had reminded the audience of her achievement. In laughing at her credentials, he had spotlighted the years of labor, sacrifice, and grit that it took to earn them. The very insult meant to erase her legitimacy became the setup for her most powerful display of it. Narrator's voice settled over the tension, heavy with foreshadowing. Levin thought his history would repeat itself, that arrogance would once again drown out dignity. But what he did not know was that Jasmine Crockett's story was not one of shrinking. It was one of rising, and in her silence, she was already rewriting the script. The villain had revealed his arrogance, his weakness disguised as strength. Now it was time to understand the hero, the journey that forged her calm, the resilience that gave her silence power, and the backstory that would make her clapback echo far beyond this moment. Because Crockett's strength was not just in what she would say, it was in everything that brought her to this stage, prepared to face men like Levin and turn their sneers into stepping stones. And that story was about to unfold. Before Jasmine Crockett ever walked into that room, before she ever found herself staring down Mark Levin's smirk, she had already fought battles that would have broken lesser spirits. Her story didn't begin with a microphone or a camera. It began in the quiet grit of determination, in a world where nothing was handed to her and everything had to be earned. Born and raised in a country that often measured worth by the color of skin and the zip code on a birth certificate, Crockett understood early what it meant to be underestimated. She was the child who teachers sometimes overlooked, the student whose brilliance was questioned before it was celebrated. But each doubt, each slight, each barrier became fuel. Where others saw obstacles, she saw an invitation to prove them wrong. Law school wasn't just an academic pursuit for her, it was an act of defiance. Every lecture she absorbed, every case she studied, every grueling exam she conquered was a rejection of the stereotype that whispered she didn't belong. She carried not just her own ambition into those classrooms, but the weight of those who had been told the same lies before her. You're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not one of us. By the time she earned that degree, it wasn't a piece of paper. It was a shield forged in sacrifice and sleepless nights, a testament to survival and resilience. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't satisfied with personal victories. She chose to turn her knowledge outward, to use the law not as a weapon of privilege, but as a tool of protection for those ignored by the system. In courtrooms across her community, she stood for clients who couldn't afford polished attorneys, for people the system was designed to forget. She carried their stories, their pain, and their dignity with her, sharpening her skills not in ivory towers, but in the trenches where justice often failed to reach. This was the foundation of the woman who now sat across from Levin. She was not merely a lawmaker or a congresswoman. She was someone who had built her identity on service, on fighting uphill battles with calm resolve. Her composure in that room wasn't an accident. It was the product of years spent staring down dismissive judges, skeptical juries, and hostile opponents who underestimated her at every turn. Each time, she had learned the same lesson. Dignity, discipline, and truth carried more weight than arrogance ever could. And that's why Levin's mockery didn't shake her. It was familiar. She had heard it before in different forms from different mouths. She knew what it was like to have her worth questioned, her achievements minimized, her presence mocked. But she also knew how the story ended when she stood her ground. The law degree he tried to belittle wasn't fragile, it was forged in fire, and that fire still burned in her calm eyes. Her political rise only amplified that story. When she stepped into Congress, she carried with her not only her credentials but her lived experience. She was unapologetically herself, representing those who rarely saw themselves reflected in the halls of power. That alone made her a target for those who thrived on exclusion. But it also made her powerful beyond measure, because every attack aimed at her only reinforced her authenticity. She wasn't polished to please, she was sharpened to fight. So when she sat across from Levin, silent and unflinching, the audience wasn't just seeing a congresswoman, they were seeing the sum of her journey. They were seeing the girl who refused to shrink in classrooms where no one expected her to excel. They were seeing the lawyer who defended the voiceless against impossible odds. They were seeing the woman who chose politics not for fame, but to ensure others could step through the same doors she had forced open. And in that silence, Levin's insult collapsed under the weight of her story. Because how do you mock someone who has already proven her worth 100 times over? How do you erase someone who carries an unshakable record of resilience? You don't. You fail. And that's what Levin had unknowingly walked into. Not a debate he could dominate, but a reckoning he could not escape. The narrator's voice cut through like thunder rolling over the horizon. This was not the story of a woman who shrank. This was the story of a woman who rose. Every challenge, every dismissal, every sneer before this moment had only prepared her for what was about to come. The audience could feel it, the buildup of years converging into this one exchange. Crockett's backstory wasn't just history, it was the wind at her back, the strength in her silence, the calm before her clapback. And as Levin leaned in, believing he still held the upper hand, he didn't realize that the ground had already shifted beneath him. Because the escalation was coming, and when it did, his smirk would no longer shield him, it would expose him. The air grew tighter with every passing second. Levin, sensing that silence was not breaking in his favor, pressed harder. He leaned back in his chair with a laugh that tried to sound confident but landed closer to nervous. "What's the matter, Congresswoman?" he goaded, eyebrows raised in mock concern. "Did they not teach you how to respond at your so-called law school?" The words rolled out like a challenge, sharp enough to sting yet desperate enough to reveal his unease. The room shifted again. Some chuckled reflexively, but many stayed still, caught in the gravity of Crockett's composure. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She let Levin's noise wash over her like a wave that crashes and breaks, leaving behind nothing but silence. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus. It was the same look she had carried into countless courtrooms, the same expression that unsettled prosecutors who realized too late that their case wasn't as solid as they thought. That gaze was a warning. She was not rattled, and the game was no longer his. Levin, oblivious or unwilling to see it, raised his voice again. "You strut around with that degree like it means something," he sneered, his hand slicing the air. "But tell me this, what have you actually accomplished? What law, what precedent, what contribution? All I see is another paper politician trying to play lawyer on television." His words echoed with arrogance, but underneath, the cracks were widening. Every insult seemed louder, harsher, less controlled, as if he were fighting not just her but the silence that refused to yield. The crowd leaned forward, torn between the urge to see him push further and the anticipation of what Crockett's stillness promised, a reckoning. And then it happened, the first ripple of audience reaction. A murmur rolled through the room, not in Levin's favor but in hers. People noticed his desperation, the way he repeated himself, circling the same attack as if louder volume would make it true. Meanwhile, Crockett sat steady, her hands folded, her calm a stark mirror reflecting his unraveling. The narrator's voice pierced the mounting tension. The room expected her to lash out, to meet his fury with fury. But they were witnessing something different, a strategy of discipline, the silence before the storm. Levin, sensing the shift but refusing to back down, leaned closer. "Go on, Congresswoman," he pressed, almost begging now. "Defend yourself. Defend that degree. Tell us why anyone should take you seriously." The bait dangled in the air, but Crockett didn't bite. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, the kind of breath that announces not surrender, but preparation. The murmur of the crowd grew louder, swelling into a low hum of expectancy. Even Levin seemed to falter, his voice trailing as he realized he was no longer commanding the room. And then she moved. Just slightly, leaning forward with an elegance that carried more weight than all of Levin's gestures combined. Her lips parted, and her voice, steady and sharp, broke through the tension like a blade through cloth. The audience froze. Levin's smirk flickered. She was about to answer, not with volume, not with defensiveness, but with the kind of precision that could silence a room and etch itself into memory. And as the crowd held its breath, it became clear. The escalation was over. The storm had arrived. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to say would not just reclaim her dignity, it would strip Levin of his. Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the haze of Levin's bluster like a bell tolling in a cathedral, clear, resonant, undeniable. She didn't raise her volume to match his, didn't meet mockery with mockery. Instead, she spoke with the deliberate precision of someone who knew that silence had already weakened her opponent, and now every word would land like a hammer against glass. "You know, Mark," she began, her tone calm yet edged with steel, "it's funny how threatened some people get when a black woman walks into a room with the same credentials they claim to respect." The crowd stirred, the shift immediate. A few audible gasps slipped through the tension, and Levin's smirk faltered into something closer to a grimace. For the first time, the rhythm of the exchange belonged entirely to her. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unbroken. My law degree wasn't a coupon. It wasn't a prize from the bottom of a cereal box. It was earned in classrooms where people like me were told not to bother, in libraries where I studied until the sun came up, in exams designed to weed out anyone who didn't already come from privilege. That degree is more than paper. It's proof. Proof that the door you'd rather keep shut can't stay shut forever. A murmur spread like fire through the audience. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reversal. The insult Levin had thrown had been twisted, sharpened, and hurled back with 10 times the force. His attempt at mockery was no longer a punchline, it was a spotlight exposing his own fragility. Crockett didn't stop. Her words built momentum, each line layered with the weight of experience. "And let me tell you what that degree has done," she said, her voice steady but rising now with conviction. "It has defended clients who couldn't afford the luxury of a legal army. It has protected people this system was designed to forget. It has stood in courtrooms where the odds were stacked, and it has forced the powerful to reckon with the truth. That degree doesn't need your validation. It's already validated by the lives it has touched." The audience erupted in applause. Levin shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though the room had grown too hot. He tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand, not in anger but in authority. The room quieted instantly, and Levin, uncharacteristically, fell silent. She fixed her eyes on him. "You ask what I've accomplished. I've accomplished something you never could. I've turned every insult, every dismissal, every attempt to minimize me into fuel. I don't shrink from mockery, I rise above it. Because arrogance fades, Mark. Volume fades. But dignity leaves a mark that even the loudest voices can't erase." It was the line that detonated like thunder. The audience roared, some rising to their feet. Even those who came in skeptical leaned forward, captivated by the reversal unfolding before them. Levin, for once, had no words. The very weapon he had wielded, mockery, had been dismantled and rebuilt into Crockett's badge of honor. The narrator's voice threaded over the moment. With one line, she transformed his insult into her triumph. The room that once echoed with his sneers now shook with her truth. But Crockett wasn't finished. She turned her gaze not just to Levin, but to the cameras, to the unseen audience beyond the walls of the room. "I stand here not just for myself," she declared, her voice swelling with purpose, "but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. For every immigrant whose degree was dismissed, for every woman whose intelligence was mocked, for every person of color whose achievements were undermined. I carry their stories in mine. And when you laugh at me, you laugh at them. And that's something this country will not tolerate anymore." It was no longer a debate, it was a declaration. Crockett had seized the stage, redefined the terms, and elevated the moment into something bigger than the two of them. The clapback was not simply about silencing Levin. It was about rewriting the narrative of legitimacy itself. Levin shifted again, visibly rattled, his face flushing. He muttered something under his breath, but it was swallowed by the wave of applause that refused to quiet. The cameras zoomed in not on him, but on her, the woman who had just turned derision into destiny. And as the cheers rolled on, Crockett delivered the closing strike, soft but devastating. "You can mock my degree all you want, but the truth, Mark, is this. Every time you try to silence me, my voice only grows louder. And tonight, the whole country is listening." The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was reverence. Even Levin, the man who thrived on never yielding the last word, sat still, his smirk erased, his voice gone. Narrator's voice rose again. The bulldog of conservative talk, silenced by the very woman he mocked. And as Crockett's words echoed through the room, it became clear, this wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. The moment was sealed. Levin's arrogance lay shattered, Crockett's dignity unshaken, and the audience knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. But this was only the beginning. Because once the cameras rolled and the clips hit the internet, the impact would stretch far beyond that room. The world was about to react. And what happened next would turn one exchange into a cultural earthquake. The room didn't just react, it reverberated. The applause lingered, swelling and collapsing like waves on a shore, while Levin shrank deeper into his chair, his face tight with the frustration of a man who realized he had lost not just the argument, but the moment. Crockett, however, didn't bask in the glory. She stood poised, the embodiment of calm after the storm, as though she knew this wasn't the endgame, it was the spark. Outside the chamber, cameras captured every second, every syllable. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began to ripple across the digital world. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok all ignited with hashtags blazing. Crockett clapback, degrees matter, silence by truth. The short clip of Levin's sneering, followed by Crockett's surgical dismantling, looped endlessly, each replay amplifying her voice while reducing his insult to a meme. Commentators leapt into the fray. Progressive voices celebrated it as a defining cultural moment. "This is why representation matters," one activist tweeted, "because dignity in the face of derision is the most powerful rebuttal of all." Civil rights leaders called it a masterclass in reclaiming narrative, while young students flooded feeds with their own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, mocked, and how they, like Crockett, would keep rising. But not everyone celebrated. Conservative pundits scrambled to control the damage. Some doubled down, attempting to paint Crockett as overly dramatic, while others dismissed the exchange entirely. Yet the louder they shouted, the smaller their arguments seemed in comparison to the visual evidence. Levin silenced, Crockett triumphant. The contrast was undeniable. The more they tried to spin, the more viral her clapback became. The media latched on. Morning shows ran the clip before their headlines, replaying her final words like gospel. One host leaned in toward the camera, saying, "There are moments in politics that transcend the back and forth. What we just saw wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning." News articles dissected the exchange frame by frame, noting Levin's shifting posture, the breaking of his smirk, the thunderous applause. Opinion pieces labeled it, the moment arrogance met its match. But perhaps the most powerful shockwave wasn't in the media, it was in the people. In classrooms, young women replayed the clip and whispered, "That's me someday." In immigrant households, parents shared it with their children as proof that their sacrifices meant something. In workplaces, employees who had been belittled by managers found themselves standing taller, inspired by a woman who showed that dignity could pierce mockery like a sword through armor. The internet became a tapestry of voices echoing her words. One viral TikTok stitched Crockett's line, "My degree isn't paper, it's proof," with clips of everyday people holding up their diplomas, their work badges, their family photos. Another edit layered her words over a montage of civil rights leaders and trailblazers, drawing a direct line from her defiance to the struggles of those who came before. Levin, meanwhile, faced the opposite fate. His sneer was memed into oblivion, captioned with jokes about cereal box prizes and mock degrees. Late-night comedians tore into him, reenacting the exchange with biting humor. In the public eye, he wasn't the bulldog anymore. He was the man who got buried by the truth. The narrator's voice cut in. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural mirror, showing America what happens when mockery collides with resilience. And in that reflection, millions saw themselves. As the days passed, the numbers told the story. Tens of millions of views, thousands of articles. A speech that was no longer just Crockett's, it had become a rallying cry. And with each share, with each replay, the clapback grew larger than the room where it was born. But beneath the celebration, a question simmered. What would this moment mean in the larger war of narratives? Because while Crockett had won the battle, Levin's camp wasn't retreating quietly. And in the polarized storm of American politics, every victory comes with new fronts to defend. The cameras had caught the clapback. The world had amplified it. Now the stage was set for the next clash. And as Crockett stood on the other side of the storm, one truth remained clear. She had not just silenced a man. She had awakened a movement. As the echoes of applause faded, the significance of what had just unfolded began to crystallize. Jasmine Crockett's words were more than a victory in a single exchange. They were a declaration of principles that stretched far beyond the walls of that room. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Dignity cannot be mocked, merit cannot be erased, and resilience carries a weight that arrogance can never match. Crockett's calm defiance transformed an attack into an emblem of empowerment. Every sneer Levin had thrown, every condescending comment, was rendered powerless against the truth of her journey. She didn't just defend her law degree. She reframed it as a symbol of all who had been underestimated, marginalized, or dismissed. Her response became a mirror for the audience, reflecting the experiences of countless women, immigrants, and people of color whose achievements were often belittled. The power of her example was not only in the words she spoke, but in the way she spoke them. She demonstrated that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, gathers, and strikes with precision. In doing so, she reclaimed the narrative, proving that respect and authority are earned through persistence, sacrifice, and integrity, not through volume or aggression. This was a lesson that resonated far beyond partisan lines. In households, classrooms, and offices across the country, viewers internalized the message. Arrogance may provoke, mockery may sting, but truth and dignity endure. Crockett showed that responding with measured strength, grounded in reality and experience, transforms ridicule into a platform for inspiration. She reminded her audience that the very qualities some attempt to belittle are often the ones that create lasting impact. Crockett's moment also emphasized the importance of representation. Her presence, her composure, her mastery of the narrative symbolized the broader fight for recognition in spaces where doors have historically been closed. She became a living example of how perseverance, intelligence, and poise can dismantle prejudice, not through confrontation alone, but through unwavering self-assurance and purpose. The moral was clear. When faced with derision, rising above does not mean retreating. It means asserting the value of your work, your story, and your integrity with courage and clarity. It means turning personal victories into collective inspiration, showing others that setbacks, insults, and doubt are stepping stones, not chains. Narrator: in the clash between arrogance and resilience, dignity will always carry the louder voice. When mockery meets preparation, when scorn meets history, the result is a lesson no one can ignore. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend a law degree. She defended every dream that had ever been doubted, every voice that had ever been silenced, and every person who had been told they were less than enough. In that light, the exchange was no longer just a debate. It became a blueprint for empowerment. Her triumph offered a universal truth. Authenticity, persistence, and courage have the power to shift culture, to challenge assumptions, and to inspire action. It showed that moments of personal vindication can ripple outward, influencing conversations, perceptions, and the very fabric of public discourse. As the cameras faded and the viral clips continued their journey across social media, the lesson remained embedded. Mockery fades, arrogance fades, but truth, resilience, and dignity leave an indelible mark. And for the millions who witnessed it, one realization settled in like a quiet, unstoppable force. The power of rising above is greater than the power of tearing down, and sometimes, a single voice, measured and unwavering, can change the conversation for an entire nation. Jasmine Crockett had not only won the moment, she had illuminated a path forward. And the world, watching, understood that in dignity there is victory. As the dust settled and the viral clips continued to spread across screens, one truth was undeniable. Mark Levin's mockery had met its match. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her credentials, but had transformed an attempted insult into a moment of inspiration, a rallying point for everyone who had ever been underestimated. The room had been silenced, but the impact reverberated far beyond its walls, touching hearts and sparking conversations across the country. This wasn't just a story about a law degree or a political clash. It was about the enduring power of dignity, the unshakable weight of resilience, and the courage to rise above mockery and prejudice. Crockett's composure, her precision, and her unwavering confidence had turned a tense confrontation into a cultural milestone. She reminded viewers that personal victories are amplified when they become symbols of broader struggle, hope, and representation. And now the story passes to the audience. The call is clear. Stand firm in the face of derision, defend your truth, and use your voice to uplift not just yourself, but everyone who looks to you for inspiration. Share these moments, celebrate them, and carry the lesson forward, that courage, integrity, and dignity are stronger than mockery, louder than arrogance, and more enduring than any insult. Subscribe to join the conversation, share the story with those who need to see it, and be part of a movement that values truth over bluster, achievement over dismissal, and resilience over ridicule. Because when voices like Jasmine Crockett's rise, the world is forced to listen, and it is changed, one courageous moment at a time.